The reason why I had you join a little bit later in the second part today is I need at least 15 minutes to convert the Zoom meeting, and if it doesn't convert normally, it's a real trouble getting it converted, and if I don't get it converted, I can't place it on YouTube. So the easiest thing to do is to promptly stop at 2. I need 15 minutes time to get it to convert, and I knew I was going to need to start at least 2 minutes later, so that's why we started later. Any questions about anything? All right, let's start recording. Maybe I am recording. Share the screen. All right, we were talking about this slide here and I hadn't finished it. So let's go back to that. I'd ask the question, do you always have a prodromal period in a disease? Does anyone know? Anyone remember getting sick and you never had a prodromal period? Nobody wants to talk?
I suppose. I mean, there's been times where I would come down with the flu and it would just like, it hit me out of nowhere.
Yeah, that was the case that I was going to do also. You're doing fine, you have no signs or symptoms, and there is no mild sign or symptom period. It's like 1 minute you're fine, and then the next period, it's like somebody hit you over the head with a sledgehammer. And I've had that happen where you're just feeling all of a sudden just really awful, where there was no prodromal period. And sometimes when you come down with the flu, there is no prodromal period. Okay? So there isn't always a prodromal period. And I think most of us have experienced when we've had the flu where it hits you really quickly, really hard. There's also times when there is no period of decline or period of convalescence. Can anyone tell me an example of that? How about when the patient gets sick and they die? There is no period of decline or period of convalescence. It used to be that with HIV, all cases ended in the period of illness and the patient died. That's not the case anymore. And like I said, there's a few people who entered the period of convalescence. But sometimes, if a patient gets sick and they die, there is no period of decline or period of convalescence. There's always an incubation period. There's always a period of illness. So let's, let me ask, are there any questions about that previous slide? Let me ask that. Any questions about the development of disease and the stages of disease development? All right, let's move on to the spread of infection. In order for a patient to get infected, there has to be a reservoir of infection. And the reservoirs are the continual sources of the disease-causing organism. Reservoirs can be living or non-living. So for human diseases, humans are a common reservoir. For some diseases, like AIDS and gonorrhea, the only reservoir are other humans. Okay? Any question about that? Not only can sick humans give disease to people, but there can be carriers who have inapparent infections or an asymptomatic disease or latent disease. And with COVID-19, the CDC estimates that about 1 in 3 patients is asymptomatic. And they can spread on the disease and they don't even know they're sick. Any question about humans as being a reservoir for other diseases? With COVID-19, at the moment, humans are the only reservoir of disease. Nobody has gotten infected from a cat or a dog, or except for the first patient, nobody's gotten infected from a spiny anteater. Okay? It is true that COVID-19 can infect your cats, and cats and ferrets and humans are a particular risk for coming down with COVID-19. I don't know why, but those animals are at risk. I would say a spiny anteater is probably at risk also to getting COVID-19. People have spread their disease to their cats and their dogs. So dogs can get COVID-19, but dogs are more resistant. And I don't know. I don't think that people can get COVID-19 from dogs, but I'm not positive about that. It is possible to get COVID-19 from your cat, but most cats are getting infected by people. And it's their own owners they're getting their infection from. Okay? But cats can spread COVID-19. Any question about any of that? Another reservoir besides human reservoirs are animal reservoirs. Some diseases, like rabies, only comes from an animal. Lyme disease also comes from an animal. Malaria comes from mosquitoes. Zoonoses are animal diseases that may be transmitted to humans. And actually, COVID-19 wasn't a spiny anteater, and then it's crossed over to humans. But now it's being transmitted human to human, so it's no longer called a zoonotic disease. But initially it was. It started that way. So a zoonotic disease is an animal disease that can be transmitted to humans. And some diseases don't spread human to human, like rabies. You cannot get rabies from another human, unless maybe you were to eat somebody who actively had a rabies infection. But rabies does not spread patient to patient. It just doesn't spread among humans. So rabies is a disease we get from other animals, particularly dogs, but you can get it from other animals. Bats is a common one. You can get it from cats, foxes. I'm trying to remember some other animals you can get rabies from, but those are a couple. You can also get diseases from non-living reservoirs. And that's commonly how people get botulism and tetanus, where we get the disease-causing organism from a non-living reservoir. And we're talking about canned food that you could argue whether that food is dead or alive. It once was alive, but when it's canned, it's no longer alive. And so that's why it's put into the non-living reservoir. And several examples of non-living reservoir, common human illnesses, are probably millions of people per year get infections from non-living reservoirs, such as eating things that contaminate them from the soil, the water, the lettuce. In third world countries, there can be bad water, which actually gives Americans Montezuma's revenge. That's a non-living reservoir. And then lots of people eat lettuce and can get gastroenteritis from bacteria on the lettuce. Oftentimes that when you're getting disease from eating lettuce, they find out that the farmer recently an organic farmer recently gave fertilizer to help the lettuce grow, and that's a bad thing to do before you harvest. So if you give fertilizer, it should be when the lettuce is little, and then you're letting it grow for several weeks before you harvest it. All right, any question about any of that?
Could a non-living reservoir be a fungi?
The
The fruiting body?
About a fungal disease?
No, a non-living reservoir.
Yeah, if you were to get a bacteria infection from eating fungi, you could get a disease from the bacteria on the fungi. And if you're eating like old mushrooms that are slimy, people come down with gastroenteritis, so you should throw out those old mushrooms. But yes, you can get diseases from eating food, especially food that's gone bad, or food that isn't handled in the proper way, and that would be a non-living reservoir. Okay, any other questions? Transmission of disease. Disease is transmitted by three principal routes, where the causative agent comes to the susceptible host by three different transmission routes, and it moves from the reservoir of infection to the susceptible host. The three principal routes of disease transmission is contract transmission, where the host is specifically touching the reservoir of disease. There's also vehicle transmission, where some vehicle brings disease to the healthy person and the healthy person gets it sick. And then there's vector transmission, where some animal brings the disease-causing organism to the healthy individual. So vehicle is where an object, or water, something inanimate, brings disease to the host. And then a vector is where an animal brings the disease-causing organism to the host. Any question about any of that? And by animal, it can be a mammal or an insect. Okay? Contact transmission. There are three types of contact transmission. There's direct, person-to-person transmission. Requires close association between an infected individual or the reservoir and the susceptible host, such as a handshake, that would be direct. Kissing, also direct. Contaminated with a, well, that's indirect, sorry. All right, any questions about direct contact transmission, where you're touching somebody? Indirect, where the disease-causing organisms moves from the reservoir to a living or a non-living object. And when we're talking about disease coming from an object, we have a special term for that. We call it fomite. So a fomite is an object that a person gets the disease from. So when somebody sneezes and sneezes on their hand, and they cause the disease organism to be on their hand, and then they touch a doorknob, the doorknob is a fomite, and then the next person who touches the doorknob can pick up that disease-causing organism. You can get indirect contact with the disease-causing organism by contacting contaminated tissue, by contacting contaminated money, or contaminated like a baseball when children are playing, or some other ball. Any question about indirect contact? That's where the organism is spread by a fomite, a non-living object. Contact transmission is also spread by droplet transmission, and that is transmission via airborne droplets that travel less than 1 meter from an infected patient or an infected animal. I have to tell you that this is different from airborne transmission, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm not going to quiz you on droplet transmission just because I don't like the distinction between droplet transmission and airborne transmission. And droplet is considered contact because it's less than 1 meter, and airborne is more than 1 meter. And I just decided a long time ago that I'm not going to quiz you on that. I will quiz you on direct and indirect. But droplet, I think it's an arbitrary division. It's 1 meter. I mean, it's defined, but still it's arbitrary. And COVID-19 travels more than 1 meter, for example. It travels about 6 feet, which is close to 2 meters. And so if it's traveling COVID-19 from somebody's airborne cough, and it's traveling only 1 meter, they classify that as droplet contact transmission. Okay? And yet, if it's somebody sneezes and it travels more than 1 meter, it would be classified as airborne transmission and not as droplet transmission. And I just decided a long time ago I'm not going to get into that mess because, like I said, I think it's kind of arbitrary where they drew the line for what's droplet transmission and what's airborne transmission. And then airborne transmission isn't contact transmission, it's indirect transmission. Okay? And I just decided that's just too confusing. I'm not going to talk about that. I mean, I did talk about it, but I'm not going to quiz you on it. Okay? So here we're looking at some contact transmission, direct high-fiving, droplet transmission, which I won't quiz you on, where the droplets you can see here in 1 meter is about there. This would be beyond 1 meter. And then indirect transmission, the baseball carrying the disease-causing organism. So indirect transmission, if he handles it by this hand and then inoculates his face, he'll get it, this player here. Any question about any of that? Vehicle transmission. That's where transmission of an organism happens by an inanimate reservoir, such as food, water, or body fluids. There are 3 types of vehicle transmission. You can have waterborne transmission, such as where somebody drinks the water and it's contaminated with sewage, and so the person gets disease from drinking the water. In third world countries, their water supply isn't too well, and the sewage sometimes leaks into like their well water, and so this can happen. This is very rare actually in the United States, where we have waterborne transmission. Any question about any of that? Foodborne transmission, where food spreads the disease-causing organism. That usually happens in undercooked food, like undercooked pork giving trichinosis, or poorly stored food, like somebody cooked up something and then they let it sit too long, or they put it in too big of a vat, and then they put it in the refrigerator and it took too long to cool, and so the food spoilage organisms grew in the food, and then somebody brought it out and then served it. They might have heated it. And the food looks good, smells good, and tastes good, but there are disease-causing organisms in the food, and then that can cause vehicle transmission by the food. It may also be unsanitary handling of the food, like you have probably heard. When you're touching raw meat, you should never touch something that is going to be eaten that isn't going to be cooked, and you should go wash your hands, because otherwise you're spreading around the microbes that are on the raw meat. So when you're touching raw meat, you should then wash your hands before you go back to food preparation, like cutting celery that you're adding to a salad or something like that. Any question about foodborne transmission? And then here we have the second vehicle transmission, which is airborne transmission, and that's when an airborne droplet travels more than 1 meter from the reservoir to a new host. And once again, I'm not going to quiz you on airborne transmission, because this right here would be airborne transmission, if you can see the spray up there, and then this would be droplet transmission. And I just don't want to draw the line at 1 meter and say it's droplet, and that's contact transmission, and then airborne is vehicle transmission, and it's beyond 1 meter. It just is too arbitrary for me. Okay? Any question about vehicle transmission? Now, vehicle transmission can be when somebody drinks out of a glass and then you drink out of the glass, and when somebody touches a doorknob and you touch a doorknob. All right, any question about that? And that would be the general case, because that wouldn't be waterborne or foodborne. So that would be a general vehicle. A vector transmission. When an animal carries the disease-causing organism to the host. The most important group of vectors are arthropods, especially fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes. But really any biting insect can do that. And then flies can pick up disease-causing organism on their feet and then carry it to food. The transmission can be mechanical, where the insect picks it up on its feet and then brings it to the food. And that's passive transport, where the microorganisms picked up on the feet, and then the feet touch the food, and then the food is eaten by the human. So the human gets the bacteria that came from the original source, the reservoir, that was brought to the host by an animal and then the food. Okay? So this person doesn't even realize he's consuming microorganisms that would cause disease. Any question about that? There's also where transmission happens with a vector by biological transmission. And that means the pathogen is actively reproducing inside the vector. Like in a mosquito, it spreads malaria, and the malaria is actually growing in the mosquito as well as in the patient. So when the mosquito bites this individual here, it can pick up the malaria, and then the malaria will grow in the mosquito, and then the mosquito can bite another patient, spreading the malaria. So that's biological transmission. Any question about any of that? All right. I think we're going to finish this, so let's go ahead and just introduce the next topic, and then we'll end this at 3 o'clock. I want to talk about nosocomial infections in great detail, because these are diseases that a patient gets from going to a hospital or hospital-like or healthcare facility. And these are infections the patient would not get if they had not gone to the hospital or the healthcare facility.
Are these the same
These are
things they called
infections
HAIs?
that we don't want to spread. What?
Are these the same thing that the book called HAIs?
Can you say that again?
Is this what the book called HAIs?
Can you give me the long name for that?
Healthcare associated infections?
Yes. There are different terms for that. I thought that your textbook was calling it nosocomial infections. Are you not using Tutora? Is the author Tutora?
Yes, 12th edition microbiology.
Okay. I will update this slide and give the other term there because, like I said, there are a couple of terms for this, but yeah, that's healthcare acquired infections. And the patient would not get that if they had not gone to a healthcare facility. Okay? And I think I'll want to stop here because I want to talk about this at great length. And I've got another day to talk about this. And I do want to talk about this at great length. So I think we'll stop here. Are there any other questions? All right, remember there's going to be a quiz on Friday. I've got to make it, and I'll try and make that today. So I'll see you later. You can use the extra time today to work on your project for the lab. You have to work on the infectious diseases. And get started on that because pretty soon you're going to have 2 lab projects and they're going to take a lot of your time. All right? Well, I'll see you next Monday. All right.